Peter Bunzl had always wanted to tell stories, and as a child found his inspiration visiting TV and film sets, including James Bond and Postman Pat, where his mother worked as a costume designer. After studying at art college and film school, he worked as an animator on commercials, pop videos, and 2 BAFTA-winning children's TV shows, and then wrote and directed several successful short films before becoming a children's writer. He is probably best known for his Cogheart series of children's books, and as his 4th and final instalment, Shadow Sea, is published, Peter talked to Nikki Gamble about this conclusion to his story and his plans for the future.
Before we get into digging deep into Shadow Sea, there's some questions that I wanted to ask you. I know that you had a previous life before you were a children's writer, and that you worked in the area of animation. Is that something that you still do?
That's right, yeah. I don't work in animation anymore, but I did for a long time, for about 10 years, on different things, promos and children's TV series and some commercials. So quite a varied career, yeah.
Right. It's really interesting. I asked that for a reason, because quite a lot of children's writers I speak to, or particularly those that come from the picture book background, have also had careers in animation. And I wondered whether there was any connection between that and your writing. I'm aware very much when I'm reading the books that they almost run like a film reel in front of my eyes. So I wondered whether that influenced your writing in any way.
It did influence my writing in a massive amount of ways. I went to art college. I didn't go to university because I was very creative as a kid, and I used to like painting and drawing. I used to draw my own comic books as well as write my own stories. And if I did write stories, I'd sort of enjoy illustrating them as much as I enjoyed writing them. So that was kind of, as a kid, I was already really into illustration and animation and cartoons and stuff like that, as well as writing stories. And it just so happened I was sort of more drawn to art when I left at the end of my school career, and so I ended up going to art college. And I studied animation at art college for my degree, and then I also did a master's in animation at the National Film and Television School, which is a really good sort of film school. And on both those courses I learnt a lot about script writing, screenwriting, and putting stories together, particularly stories for animation, which are very similar to children's stories. You know, they're normally sort of fairy tale based or fantasy based. And so I learned a lot about those techniques before I even got into children's writing.
So the structuring of the story was one
influence. That was one aspect, yeah.
The other thing that I wondered whether there was any connection at all was between animation and your creation of the mechanicals, because in a way they're a different kind of animation and bringing something to life or giving it movement, which is what animation does.
I think retrospectively I wasn't thinking about it when I wrote the story, but afterwards I thought about, you know, when people ask me since, what drew you to writing a story about automatons and mechanical people that come to life, and I thought, well, it is the same as animation, like you say. It's what I loved about animation was creating a character and bringing it to life. And obviously that's the same in writing. You create a character and you bring it to life, but it's also the same in that kind of puppeteering or making robots or all of those sort of things, or making mechanical people. And I think that's what drew me to that story and those ideas in the first place. Yeah.
They are amazing, aren't they? I know that you've read about automata because I've read some of the things that you've said about them in the past. I wondered if there were any particular ones that stick in your mind, like the chess-playing Turk. That's quite a famous one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really famous one, the chess-playing Turk. And I've always wanted to write a story about that because I think it's very interesting. It was this chess player, and it beat some of the best chess minds of its time. It was a automaton, and it would you would play the first move, and then it would play a move. It's called the Turk because it had a turban on, and it was dressed in Turkish clothes. And you'd play against the Turk, and it would beat a lot of people. And it was supposed to have gone to Russia and played against Catherine the Great. It was supposed to have gone there. But retrospectively, they found out that it wasn't an automaton. It was actually a puppet, and there was someone hidden inside the cabinet under the chessboard that was basically controlling the Turk to make all the different moves, which is very interesting. And there are a lot of stories about this puppet, this mechanical puppet, and who was controlling it. And there's lots of stories about smuggling people in and out of Russia, sort of related to this story. And almost as interesting as the automatons are the kind of legends that grew up around them afterwards, that people sort of told about them.
Yeah. They are fascinating. It's slightly disappointing to think that it wasn't a genuine automaton, because they are amazing in their own right.
But there are lots of amazing real ones that exist. There's one that I have in my presentation, which was created by a man called Droz, and it is a writing automaton, and it's the name of it has just escaped me, but you wind up and it writes different sentences. And if you've seen the movie Hugo, it's a bit like the one that they feature in that movie. It also inspired the writer of Hugo with his story.
I was fortunate enough to be at the launch of that book, and that automata was on display. Wow. And what was really spooky about it is that after, or I don't know if it was that one or a different one, but after it's written, it looks up at you. Its eyes open, and it looks directly at you. And that is slightly unnerving.
It's very unnerving.
And before we get onto the book, which I really do, but I'm also fascinated by these automata, I think there was even a duck that pooped.
Yes, there was a duck that pooped. There's an amazing book by Gabby Woods called Living Dolls, which is a popular history of all the automata, and it starts with those early automata like that Vaucanson's duck, which was the pooping duck, and it goes right up to kind of modern day robots. And it's a really good sort of history of automata. But yeah, that duck was sort of entertainment in the French courts in the 18th century, I think. People used to come and watch a mechanical duck pooping, and that was obviously the height of entertainment.
It was another cheat because it didn't actually digest the food, did
no,
it? That
they
was
just
all
used
in
to
these
they just used to make up a load of poop and put it in the poop end, and then they would put the food in the food end, and then they would just I guess it would just open a hatch and let the poop out. So yeah, not another fake automaton. But the one that I also really like is the Silver Swan. I don't know if you've seen that. You can see it on YouTube, and it was made by a clockmaker called, I can't remember his name, James something, a famous British clockmaker. And it's a swan on a lake with fishes, and they're all mechanical. So on the hour, it will dip its head into the lake and sort of pull out one of these mechanical fishes. And yeah, it's very amazing to watch the clip of it.
Fantastic. And of course, your automata, your mechanicals, are part-way between that and almost going into the cyborg thing, because they're sentient beings.
Yeah, well, my favourite film growing up was Star Wars, and my favourite characters were definitely the droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, and how funny they were and how lifelike and how important to the story, how much sort of importance they had to move the story along. And so I wanted to use them, sort of create mechanical robots like you would have in Victorian times, but make them as sort of realistic, as good and as fun as the amazing robots that you see in Star Wars. So that was kind of the idea.
Last question before we really get to the book, which is what we're dying to talk about, but I'm also interested in why the Victorian period is so appealing, and it seems to be perennially appealing to writers. Automaton, I think, started in the kind of 18th century, didn't they? So why the Victorian? Why is that so appealing?
Well, when I was before I sort of worked out what time period the book was going to be set in, when I decided it was going to have automata in, I was trying to look for a kind of genre or area where that could fit, and I sort of thought about steampunk. And I remembered Philip Pullman's books and Philip Reeve's books, and I just thought, well, automata would perfectly fit into a steampunk world. And then obviously when you think about that, you think, well, it has to be, steampunk worlds are normally Victorian or Victoriana worlds, either real or imaginary. So I kind of thought, well, it has to be in a Victorian world. And then when I realised it was going to be steampunk, I thought, well, I can put in airships and things that you get in steampunk and technology from steampunk, and it'll be much more fun to do that than just have a straightforward Victorian world.
We'll come to the technology a little bit in a moment as we talk about Shadow Sea, but as a way of setting it up for us, I wonder, would you mind reading a little bit from the new book?
Yeah, sure. So this is the prologue of the book, and it takes place on a submarine under the sea, and you'll meet the new characters. First, there was darkness, then patches of watery green light, then fish, whole schools of them, with luminous fins, bright as knives, glowing scales that shimmered like armour. They swam past the shadow of a submarine base that clung to the edge of a cliff beside a fathomless trench which stretched like a scar across the ocean floor. The base was shaped like a giant rusted wheel, with spokes that ran from the exterior to its centre. Parts of it were unfinished, the ties that bound it to the sea bed still under construction. Fixed with ropes and cables in place of iron trusses, the base bobbed slightly in the current. Rising from the hub was a tower with a turbine at the top, turning slowly. Through the tower's only porthole, a blonde boy of 13 with bright, inquisitive eyes could be seen sitting on the cabin floor. The boy was humming a tune to himself, a tune that matched the buzzing in the walls, as he worked on a miniature wagon. Jam jar lids made up the wagon's wheels, flattened cans its carriage. It had pencils for axles and wire for its yoke. When he was done, the boy plucked a white mouse from his pocket and tied it to the wagon. He placed the mouse on the floor and geed it along like a long-whiskered, pink-snouted pony. The mouse tottered forward on tiny red paws, pulling the wagon behind it. After a moment, it broke into a run, skittering beneath a table where two adults, a man and a woman with the same blonde hair and inquisitive eyes as the boy, sat working. The boy chased the mouse under the table and followed it out the door. Hot on its heels, he ran down the passageway. The mouse crossed grates and vents and wove beneath pipes, sticking close to the walls. It clattered its cart past damp, bulbous diving suits that stank of the sea, and stumbled across galleys and mess halls where crew members sat eating. Still the boy chased it. Finally, it ran through a crack where a door stood slightly ajar. In the room beyond, row upon row of mice scrabbled about in cages. The white mouse stopped in the centre of the floor. The boy crouched, mouth half open, stretching out a hand to pick it up. A swish of a skirt, a shiny leather shoe stepped across his path. The boy stared up. "Hey, Aunt Matilda!" A gaunt-faced woman with short, slicked-back hair, wearing a white lab coat and goggles pushed back on her head, was putting on a pair of rubber gloves. "That's Professor Milksop to you." Professor Milksop scooped up the mouse and dropped the cart unceremoniously on the floor. "This rodent's valuable. You shouldn't have taken it from the lab." "He looked sad," the boy said. "I named him Spook on account of his colouring. He looks like a spook, don't you think?" The boy glanced at the mouse scrabbling in the professor's hand. It squeaked softly. "Don't be naming them," the professor said. "Name a thing, and you start to have feelings for it." She turned away and made a sharp, jerking motion with her hands. The squeaking stopped. "Go back to your quarters now, Dane. You shouldn't be here. Could be bad for your health." The professor kicked aside the cart and headed for a second lead-lined door at the far end of the room. A door marked "Reanimation Lab. Danger. Keep out." Beneath these words was a picture of a snake curled in a circle, eating its own tail. Dane rubbed a hand across his face as he watched her go. Then he narrowed his eyes and stared at the door. "No, he said softly, wiping a tear away. I won't.
We haven't given too much away, but it's safe to say that it is a real page-turner, and there is a great mystery to be solved. And it will be evident to people who've listened to you just read that opening for us that you have gone into an American accent there, because actually this story takes us across the Atlantic to New York.
Yeah.
What did being in New York allow you to do that being in London didn't?
I love New York. It's one of my favourite cities. I've been there 3 times, and when the book sold in America, I thought, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write one of the series set in America, and hopefully that will make it really popular. Well, we've yet to see if that will happen. So that was the reason. And then immediately I thought, well, New York was actually one of the few places that I've been to in the States. So I thought, well, I'll set it in New York because I love New York. And then I started to research New York at that time, and a lot of interesting stuff was going on. And 10 years previously, electricity had kind of been invented, basically, by Edison and Tesla. And there was a big battle over who was going to control commercial electricity between those two people. And they were both crazy inventors, inventing lots and lots of crazy inventions that we still use today, and both really interesting guys. And that was what attracted me to New York. And I kind of knew that the book was going to be about electricity, and originally it was going to feature Tesla and Edison, but it didn't in the end because it got a bit wilder. But so that was the reason that I set it in that location.
That's interesting, because one of my questions was about Tesla and Edison, and the fact that in your book there's a fire, isn't there? Or the Edison's electricity doesn't work, and then Tesla's version of magnetic,
yes.
whatever it is, takes over.
Yeah.
And I just wondered why he's a name that is not as well known as Edison.
I read a really interesting book about Tesla and Edison, and it's called The Last Days of Night by Graham Moore. And it is about the current wars between Tesla and Edison. And it's very interesting, there's lots of machinations and shenanigans and bad behaviour on both sides. And the reason Edison is more famous than Tesla is because Edison was kind of one of those American showmen like P.T. Barnum or Walt Disney, and he liked to have his name in the newspapers, so he was constantly doing self-promotion, whereas Tesla was kind of quite a strange loner guy who sort of lived in hotel rooms and didn't like speaking to people and wasn't very social, and so that's probably the reason why Edison is more famous, although Tesla was a way more amazing inventor. He just, in my opinion, he seemed to come up with all these crazy ideas that he was trying to do, and he worked out how to get alternating current working, which meant you could send electricity much further distances than you could with Edison's system, which was direct current, which you could only send it a short way.
It was fascinating, because as I was reading, I was thinking how New York was such a fantastic setting for your book because of things like that. I know that's only a tiny little mention in your book, but actually just the building of the skyscrapers at that time, it must have been
so all of those things were going on. You know, the first skyscraper was being built at that time, and all of these interesting people were living in New York and congregating in New York, and all of this amazing technology, turn of the century technology that went on to sort of develop into modern technology was being created there as well. So that was part of the reason to set it there.
Fantastic. The story also has, as you say, a new child character, new mechanical, who looks after him, his nurse.
Yeah.
And his aunt, who he arrives in New York with. One of the things that I thought was really great was you never quite know who the villains are as this story goes along.
Yeah, I always want to try and put a twist into the story, and so I'm always thinking of a way that I can put a twist in. And normally what happens is, as you're writing it, you get to that part of the story where the villain is revealed, and your brain writes a different name than what you thought was going to be the villain, and then you think, oh, that's interesting, and then you start to think about, that could be the villain, or that could be the bad guy, and then you try and go back and sort of work out how you could make that happen. Because if you suddenly, as you're writing it, come up with a completely different answer to that question, then you know that's a twist that's going to work because you haven't thought of it before. I guess it's the same as writing a murder mystery. I guess if you're Robin Stevens or Agatha Christie and you've set everyone up that they could have done it, and then you can just choose which one of them is the murderer depending on who's the most interesting choice, I guess.
Yeah. Makes it not too predictable,
Yeah.
you would hope, for the reader.
Yeah.
And as I say, you're kind of left guessing, which is good. You take us under the water. So we've been up in the sky with the Zeppelins, and now we have a Zeppelin-shaped submarine.
Yeah.
Why under the sea? What was the fascination there?
I wanted to write like a space story where the characters are trapped on a spaceship, and I knew I couldn't really do that in this series because it's a bit too wild. And so I thought, well, what's the equivalent that you could do that's taking place on Earth? And I thought, well, undersea exploration, because you're kind of like, you're trapped on a spaceship. If you're trapped on a submarine, you can't go outside without putting on a suit, and it becomes like claustrophobic, like those space movies like 2001 or Alien, where everyone is trapped on the spaceship and they have to kind of work out a way of getting out. And that was the kind of story that I wanted to write. So I was trying to come up with a situation that was similar enough to that.
That's fascinating because when they try to... There's a branch of science, isn't there, where they're trying to work out what life is like on distant planets. And in order to do that, they study the deep oceans.
Right, yeah.
It's called astrobiology, and I understand that it's the oceans that they go to try and help them understand outer space.
I didn't know that.
It's amazing, isn't it? And as you say, lots of connections there. And probably we understand more about the moon than we do
about what's at the bottom of the sea. Yeah, I would say so.
There's also another motif that appears quite a lot in this story, the Ouroboros symbol. And it's something that I've seen before. What's its provenance? Where does that come from?
I wanted to have a symbol that represented life and death for reasons that you'll discover in the story. And so I looked up kind of ancient symbols on the internet and different religions and different sort of tribal symbols. And that one jumped out at me because I thought, it's quite creepy and it has a kind of scary quality to it. So I thought that was interesting. And then I realised it's also the symbol on the front of the book in Neverending Story. If you've seen the movie, The Neverending Story, and when Bastien Balthazar Bucks goes into the bookshop and he steals the book, and on the front of the book is an Ouroboros symbol of a snake eating its own tail. It's a bit more complicated because it's sort of swirly, but it's the same symbol. And when I realised that, I thought that's definitely the right symbol for the book.
Yeah, it's
the story.
It's a really strong symbol, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as you say, we're not giving too much away to say that it features in this story in various forms. I've also learnt through reading a little bit about you that you are a fan of the Penny Bloods or the Penny Dreadful stories. Have you read any of those yourself?
I read a little bit of Varney the Vampire. It's quite funny, but it's also quite slow going. It doesn't quite get there, so I gave up after about 20 pages or whatever. I prefer Dickens stuff, so Oliver Twist I read when I was writing Cogheart, and David Copperfield and Great Expectations, and I love all of those. And they were also all serialised fiction, because they would also come out once a week or once a month, and they would have a cliffhanger at the end. So something like Oliver Twist I really love, and I love how gruesome it is, and it is a bit like a Penny Dreadful because it just gets worse and worse and worse as it goes along.
I mean, they're fascinating. I don't know how writers could have earned a living by just getting this stuff out there quickly.
I don't know. But yeah, that's a lot of stories were published like that in Victorian times.
Yeah.
And Dickens was supposed to be really good at it. He could just I don't know how he did it, and then he made all the plots join up at the end. I've no idea.
I know. He must have had that arc in his head and then serialised it, probably. And what's your writing process like when you're writing a book?
I write the whole story, the whole first draft, and then it goes through a lot of changes. So it went through 5 or 6 full drafts before it went to copy edit, before it was sort of the last little fiddling around with the spellings and stuff. And it changes quite radically. So I could never write a book like that where you're releasing part of it into the world and then writing the next bit. It would just be impossible. Because the first draft was very different from what ended up being in the book.
When you first wrote Cogheart, did you know that you were going to have this trajectory and that you were going to be ending up going to New York with Shadow Sea, or is it a book by book?
It's a book by book thing. So I had no idea where I was going to go after the first book, but I wrote quite a lot of sort of extra material around the first book that never made it into the first book, and funnily enough, that has kind of all of those things have kind of gone into the next 3 books. So little bits of them, little bits of story that were sort of discarded from the first book has made it into each of the other books.
Really? Can you give us some examples?
So in Cogheart there was a scene where they went to the circus, and or they didn't go to the circus, but when they were running away they accidentally sort of stumbled upon the circus and they stayed the night there, and you saw a little bit of it, and that got cut because it was just too random. So that became Sky Circus. And then there was also, at the circus, there was a magician character who was a bit of a crook, and he became one of the characters in Moonlocket. And when I was pitching what the second book in the series was going to be, I pitched them an idea where Lily and Robert get stuck in this kind of underground base, and they're being chased around and lots of horrible things happen to them there. And I realised when I finished Shadow Sea, it was kind of similar. It was a pitch that they didn't go for at the time, but it was kind of similar to the ending of Shadow Sea, where they're stuck on the submarine and they have to escape from some horrible villain. So nothing is ever wasted when you think of an idea. Even if they say no to it, you can always use it somewhere else at a later date.
Because your world building is so very visual, I'm fascinated to know whether you actually draw as part of your writing process or not.
I don't know, but I collect a lot of visuals. I collect images on Pinterest of the places of New York in Victorian times, and there's loads of brilliant sites that have images. And for the other books, similar things. Sometimes I draw like a map or a schematic of one of the places that's in the story if it helps me sort of visualise the geography of the place, but I won't draw. I don't draw the characters or the settings or anything.
Oh, interesting. I'm interested as well in the relationship between human and technology. And I think one of the points that comes across quite strongly in this book is about the relationship of nature and the man-made. There's a point in the story where Lily looks at that beautiful blend of contradiction. And I think often with children's books that have a kind of ecological element to them, technology is nearly always the villain.
Yeah, that's true.
But not in your book. There's a sort of love of both.
Yeah, I'm a techno-geeky person. I love technology. I love nature as well, but yeah. I think whatever the solution is to the current problems that are existing, the ecological crisis, the solution is going to be technological. It's not going to be everyone stop driving cars. I mean, yeah, lovely, it would be great if that happened, but it's just not going to happen. Everyone stop flying, everyone stop driving cars, everyone stop using this and that, unless people come up with a solution, a technological solution, which they already are, with green energy and stuff, but in all of those different spheres, unless they come up with solutions, it's just not going to be possible. So it's technology that's going to sort of solve those problems, hopefully.
I'm recognising the beauty in what technology allows humans to achieve. I think New York is an example of that. You see it and you have that intake of breath because that's been created.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? It's like a termite mound or something like that. It's like insects have those kind of building things and that's maybe where, other mammals don't maybe have that as much, but I think humans have all of those different sensibilities from all different kinds of creatures.
Mm-hmm. With Shadowsea, what were you most pleased about when you'd finished the book?
The most fun thing to write about was the hotel, the Murray Hill Hotel, and researching New York hotels. And originally it wasn't set in a hotel, it was set in an early draft, it was set in an apartment. And then we sort of discussed with my editor and discussed that they were going to be staying in a hotel instead. And once we decided that, it was just so much fun because you can actually find the menus for these hotels online, and people sort of talk about what they had for dinner when they went there, and there's stories about the hotels and the people that stayed there. I was even able to find like a Christmas menu for the Murray Hill Hotel that was 1 year out from when the book was set, and you could see what they'd had for Christmas dinner at the hotel. So it was really fun to research that and to sort of work out what it was going to be like to stay in that Victorian hotel in New York.
Yeah. You certainly get a feel of the Titanic generation. I know it's before that, but that idea of that opulence.
There was so much opulence. There were lots of people that were regulars in these hotels, and they would come there for lunch and dinner all the time, or they would stay there. They would live in the hotel and just have everything done for them. And there was this one guy I read, he would have breakfast every day in the hotel, and he would have like 10 eggs and 10 rashers of bacon and 10... He was like so over the top. It's really interesting to sort of hear about these characters.
Can I ask, I'm studiously avoiding getting to conclusions and where the story's going. I know people are going to be thrilled to read it, but do we have anything to look forward to after Shadowsea?
Currently, I haven't got any plans to write another Cogheart book, so I'm working on something else with Usborne at the moment, which is a book about magic, and it's set in the 18th century. So it's actually set in 1726 at Kensington Palace. I don't know if you know Kensington Palace.
I do indeed.
Yeah. And it's about a boy who lived at Kensington Palace in the time of George I, and his name was Peter the Wild Boy. And he was a wild boy, as his name suggests, and because he grew up in the woods in Germany, where the royal family was from, in Bavaria, and someone found him in the woods, and they brought him to see the royal family, and he became a kind of pet of King George I, and he was lived at the royal court, and he was kind of shown around at parties and made to do tricks and stuff, and lots of philosophers were interested in him because he didn't ever learn to speak English, and he was kind of wild. Even though they dressed him up in a nice smart outfit, he was still quite wild, and he would pull things off the table and steal people's jewellery and like run around and climb the curtains or whatever. So he was a really interesting character. So I actually did an event at Kensington Palace. That's how I discovered about him. I did a pop-up event, and the woman that was before we did the event, the woman showed us around the palace, and there's a big mural on the wall of the king's staircase with all of these different servants of the king that he really liked, his favourite servants, and they were depicted in the mural. And one of them on the corner, at the top corner, is Peter the Wild Boy, and she pointed him out, and she told us his story, how he'd been brought there as a kind of curiosity for the king, and that he was only 13 years old when that happened. And I said to her, "Oh, that would make a great children's book story." And she said, "Yes, Peter, and you should write it." So that's then it kind of started to go around in my head. Then when I had to come up with a pitch to Usborne, it kind of came back to me. And there's another character in the story who is the daughter of a pirate, and she also happens to end up sort of as a prisoner in the king's palace, and she makes friends with Peter the Wild Boy, and they have an adventure together.
This sounds really exciting. So it's historical, as opposed to steampunk historical.
Yeah, it's historical. It has a little bit of magic, sort of fairy tale magic in it as well.
Right, fantastic.
Because it's kind of a fairy tale setting, really, to live in the palace.
It is indeed, and something else for us to look forward to. Peter, thank you so much for coming to
Thank
talk to
you.
us in the Reading Corner. It's been a delight.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the books.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.